The conference room felt smaller than usual that Tuesday morning. When my boss fired me for refusing to falsify safety compliance reports, my boss, Gerald Hoffman, sat at the head of the table. His expensive suit perfectly pressed, his jaw tight with irritation. I'd known this meeting was coming. For 3 weeks, he'd been pushing me to adjust the quarterly safety compliance reports. Small changes, he called them. Strategic modifications to keep the auditors happy. But I knew what he really meant. He wanted me to lie. The folder sat between us on the polished wood, filled with inspection reports showing structural violations. At our downtown construction site, workers had complained about unsafe scaffolding. Engineers had flagged inadequate support beams. Everything was documented. Everything was real. And Gerald wanted it all to disappear. "Mitchell," he said, using my first name like a weapon. "We've been over this 3 times now. The investors are already nervous about the timeline. If these reports go public, the project dies. $50 million. 300 jobs. All gone because you can't see the bigger picture." I shifted in my chair, feeling sweat gather at my collar despite the air conditioning. The violations are legitimate safety concerns. If something collapses, people could die. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost friendly. "Nothing's going to collapse. We'll fix everything during the next phase. But right now, we need clean reports to close this financing round. You're the compliance director. This is your job." My hands felt cold as I opened the folder again, scanning the highlighted sections Gerald wanted changed. Reclassify the critical violations as minor concerns. Adjust the inspection dates to show compliance before the investor deadline. Remove 3 engineering reports entirely. It wasn't just bending rules. It was manufacturing false documents that could get people killed. I'd worked in construction compliance for 8 years, ever since graduating from technical college. I'd built my reputation on accuracy and thorough documentation. Companies hired me specifically because I didn't cut corners. That reputation was everything in this industry. One compromised report could destroy a career permanently. "I can't do this," I said quietly, closing the folder. "These violations need to be addressed before we proceed." "That's not my opinion. That's building code." Gerald's friendly mask slipped. His eyes went hard and cold. "Let me be very clear about what's happening here. Either you adjust these reports by end of business today, or I'll find someone who will. And you'll be looking for work in an industry that doesn't hire people who can't follow instructions." The threat hung in the air between us. I wanted to back down. I needed this job desperately. My apartment lease was up for renewal next month. My student loans weren't getting smaller. But something in my chest refused to bend. "I won't falsify safety documents," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "If that means I lose my job, then that's what happens. But I'm not putting my name on fraudulent reports." For 3 long seconds, Gerald just stared at me. Then he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the door and opened it, calling out to the entire office floor. "Attention everyone. Mitchell here is being terminated immediately for non-compliance with company policy and insubordination. Security will escort him out." The office went silent. 40 people stopped typing, stopped talking, stopped moving. Every head turned toward the conference room where I sat frozen in humiliation. Gerald's assistant appeared with a cardboard box, and my personal belongings already packed inside. They must have prepared this before the meeting even started. They'd known I would refuse. This had been a trap from the beginning. "You have 5 minutes to collect anything else and leave the building," Gerald said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Your access credentials have been revoked. HR will contact you about final paperwork." I stood on shaking legs and took the box. Inside were my desk plant, some family photos, a coffee mug my sister gave me, and my university degree in its cheap frame. 8 years of work reduced to items that fit in 12 inches of cardboard. The walk through the office felt endless. Nobody met my eyes. A few people looked sympathetic, but nobody spoke. Nobody risked associating with someone Gerald had publicly humiliated. I understood. They had mortgages and families. Standing up for me meant becoming the next target. The security guard who escorted me to the lobby was at least professional about it. He didn't grab my arm or rush me. Just walked silently beside me as we rode the elevator down 14 floors. When the doors opened to the marble lobby, I saw 3 colleagues from other departments pretending to be busy with their phones. Word had spread that fast. Outside, the September afternoon was warm and bright, completely indifferent to my disaster. I stood on the sidewalk holding my box while people streamed past on their lunch breaks. My company ID badge was still clipped to my belt. I unhooked it and dropped it in the nearest trash can. That night, I sat on my apartment floor with the box beside me and my laptop open, scrolling through job listings I couldn't focus on. The humiliation kept replaying. Gerald's voice announcing my termination. The silent stares. The security escort like I was some kind of criminal. My phone buzzed with a text from Vincent, a colleague I'd worked with for 3 years. Sorry about what happened. For what it's worth, everyone knows you were right. I appreciated the message, but it didn't change anything. Being right didn't pay rent. The rejection emails started arriving within days. I'd sent my resume to 17 companies, carefully explaining my background in construction compliance and quality assurance. 12 sent automated rejections. 4 never responded at all. 1 actually called me for a phone screening. The conversation went well until the recruiter asked why I'd left my previous position. I tried to explain diplomatically, focusing on ethical differences and professional standards. The recruiter's tone shifted immediately. I see. Well, we'll be in touch if anything develops. They never called back. By the 3rd week, I realized Gerald had poisoned my reputation across the entire industry. Construction compliance is a small world. Everyone knows everyone. He'd probably made a few strategic phone calls, framing my termination as a personality problem or performance issue. My savings dwindled fast. Rent took most of what remained from my final paycheck. Utilities, groceries, loan payments, everything kept demanding money I didn't have. I started buying instant ramen in bulk and making coffee at home instead of stopping at the cafe. Small economies that felt pathetic but necessary. I applied to jobs outside construction, retail management, office administration, anything that would pay bills. Most applications disappeared into silence. The few interviews I got went nowhere. Without relevant experience, I was just another desperate applicant. One night, I got angry enough to draft an email to the state licensing board, detailing everything about the falsified reports Gerald had demanded. I wrote 3 paragraphs before deleting it all. Without proof, it was just my word against his. And he had lawyers. The phone call came on a gray October morning. I'd been unemployed for 6 weeks. I was starting to seriously consider moving back to my hometown and living with my parents. The embarrassment of that possibility made my stomach hurt. Is this Mitchell Carver? A woman's voice asked. Yes, speaking. My name is Brenda Ortiz. I'm a senior analyst at Kemp Associates. We're a small auditing and compliance consulting firm downtown. I came across your article on structural integrity standards from 2 years ago. Very thorough work. I blinked in surprise. I'd almost forgotten about that article. I'd written it for a trade publication during a slow month, analyzing how new building codes affected high-rise construction. Thank you. I'm glad it was useful. We're looking for someone with your expertise in construction compliance, Brenda continued. Would you be available to come in for an interview? My heart jumped. Absolutely. When works for you? We scheduled a meeting for Thursday afternoon. After hanging up, I allowed myself 5 minutes of cautious hope before reality crashed back. They'd ask why I left my previous job. They'd call Gerald for a reference. This would end like all the others. But when Thursday arrived, I put on my best interview suit and showed up 30 minutes early. Kemp Associates occupied a modest office on the 8th floor of an aging building. No marble lobby or expensive artwork. Just functional spaces and people who looked busy with actual work. Brenda met me in the small reception area. She was in her 50s with graying hair, and the kind of direct eye contact that suggested she didn't waste time on nonsense. Mitchell, thanks for coming. Let's talk in the conference room. The interview felt different immediately. Instead of generic questions about strengths and weaknesses, Brenda asked specific technical questions about compliance protocols and audit procedures. She wanted to know how I'd handled difficult situations where contractors tried to bypass safety requirements. I answered honestly, giving real examples from my previous work. After 40 minutes, she leaned back and folded her hands. I need to ask about your recent termination. Your resume shows you left Hoffman Construction in September. What happened there? I'd rehearsed this answer dozens of times, but it still felt risky. I was asked to falsify safety compliance reports. I refused. My supervisor terminated me for non-compliance with company policy. Brenda's expression didn't change. Can you be more specific about what they wanted falsified? I explained the whole situation. The structural violations, the investor pressure, Gerald's demands to adjust reports. I kept it factual and unemotional, just laying out what happened. When I finished, Brenda nodded slowly. That must have been difficult. Walking away from a job takes courage, especially in this economy. I didn't have a choice, I said. My name goes on those reports. I can't risk my license or my integrity for someone else's profit margin. Brenda smiled slightly. That's exactly the kind of person we need here. Most of our work involves reviewing financial and operational compliance for companies that want independent verification. We specifically look for people who won't compromise standards under pressure. 3 days later, she called with an offer. The salary was 20% less than I'd been making at Hoffman Construction. The benefits were basic. The office was small and unglamorous. I accepted before she finished explaining the details. Starting the new job felt like stepping into a different world. No corporate politics or status games. Just straightforward analytical work examining documents and identifying discrepancies. My first month involved reviewing purchasing records for a manufacturing company and checking their environmental compliance reports. The work was methodical and detailed. Exactly the kind of thing I was good at. I spent hours cross-referencing invoices, comparing reported numbers to actual transactions, finding the small inconsistencies that revealed larger problems. It felt good to use my skills for something legitimate. In December, Brenda assigned me to help with a construction finance audit. A regional development company wanted independent verification before finalizing a major loan. I reviewed their project documentation, checking that reported progress matched actual completion, and that safety protocols were being followed. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being paid to find exactly the kind of fraud I'd refused to commit. Winter settled into routine. I worked my cases, rebuilt my savings slowly, and tried not to think too much about Gerald and what he'd done to me. Some days were harder than others. I'd see news about Hoffman Construction completing projects, and wonder if those buildings were actually safe, or if Gerald had found someone willing to sign the reports I wouldn't. One afternoon in late February, Brenda knocked on my cubicle wall. Got something for you. Federal investigation needs consulting help on a construction fraud case. They're looking for someone with compliance expertise to review documents and identify irregularities. She handed me a sealed envelope. The case details are confidential. Read through it and let me know if you're interested. I opened the envelope after she left. The first page was a standard consulting agreement. The second page outlined the investigation scope. Federal prosecutors were building a case involving falsified safety reports and fraudulent compliance documentation at a major construction firm. My chest tightened as I read the third page. The company under investigation was Hoffman Construction. The primary suspect was Gerald Hoffman. For several minutes, I just stared at the papers, my hands trembling slightly. The universe had just handed me a choice. I could walk away, let someone else handle this case, and avoid reopening old wounds. Or I could step directly into the fight. My first instinct was to decline. The thought of digging through Gerald's files again made my skin crawl. Facing him in any capacity felt dangerous and exhausting. But then I remembered that morning in the conference room. The calculated humiliation. The way he'd destroyed my reputation without hesitation. And I remembered those structural violations I documented. Real safety issues that put real workers at risk every day. If Gerald had proceeded with those projects anyway, using falsified reports, then people might have already been hurt. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. I emailed Brenda back within an hour. I'm available for the consulting project. When do they need me to start? The federal investigator's office was downtown, in a building that looked deliberately unremarkable. Agent Torres met me in a windowless conference room, filled with bankers' boxes and stacked folders. He was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and the tired look of someone working too many cases simultaneously. Mr. Carver, thank you for coming. I understand you have history with Hoffman Construction. I worked there as compliance director until September. I was terminated after refusing to falsify safety reports. Torres nodded like this confirmed something. That termination is actually part of what triggered this investigation. One of your former colleagues filed an anonymous tip with our office 3 months ago. They suggested we look into Hoffman's compliance documentation, specifically reports filed after you left. My stomach dropped. Someone else had noticed. Someone else had cared enough to report it. What did you find? Torres opened one of the boxes and pulled out a thick file. We found the same quarterly reports you refused to alter, except in the versions submitted to investors and regulators. All those critical violations you documented have been downgraded or removed entirely. He spread several documents across the table. I recognized them immediately. The downtown project reports I'd been working on when Gerald fired me. But the versions Torres showed me had been heavily modified. Critical structural violations were now listed as minor concerns. Inspection dates had been changed to show compliance before the investor deadline. 3 separate engineering reports had been removed completely. And at the bottom of each altered document was an electronic signature. Not mine. Someone else had signed my name to reports I'd never approved. My hands shook as I picked up one of the pages. This isn't my signature. I never authorized these changes. We know, Torres said. The metadata shows these documents were modified on September 20th, 3 days after your termination. The authorization code traces back to Gerald Hoffman's administrative access. For the next 4 hours, Torres walked me through the investigation. The altered reports had been used to secure $48 million in investor financing. That money funded the downtown project despite known safety violations. Construction proceeded with inadequate structural support. In November, a scaffolding section collapsed. 3 workers were seriously injured. 2 required surgery. 1 would probably never work construction again. The accident investigation revealed the same violations I'd documented months earlier. Violations that should have stopped construction entirely. But because the official reports showed compliance, work had continued. We have enough evidence for fraud charges, Torres explained. But we need an expert witness who understands construction compliance and can explain to a jury exactly what was falsified and why it mattered. Would you be willing to testify? My mouth went dry. Testifying meant facing Gerald again. It meant public scrutiny and aggressive defense attorneys who would try to shred my credibility. It meant putting my name on record against someone with resources and connections. But it also meant finally holding him accountable. Not just for what he'd done to me, but for the workers who'd been hurt because he valued profit over safety. Yes, I said before my fear could talk me out of it. I'll testify. The trial preparation was brutal. For 6 weeks, I spent evenings and weekends working with federal prosecutors, reviewing every document, every report, every email exchange from my time at Hoffman Construction. They needed me to explain technical details in language a jury could understand. How building codes worked, what inspections were required, why certain violations were critical rather than cosmetic. The lead prosecutor was a woman named Catherine Wells. She was relentlessly thorough, questioning every detail of my testimony, making sure I could support every statement with evidence. Gerald's defense team will paint you as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, Catherine warned. They'll claim you're lying to get back at him for firing you. You need to stay calm and factual no matter what they throw at you. We practiced for hours. She played the role of hostile defense attorney, asking aggressive questions designed to rattle me. You were fired for insubordination, weren't you? So you have a personal grudge against Mr. Hoffman? Isn't it true that you falsified these reports yourself? And now blaming your former supervisor? Each question stung. But Catherine pushed me to answer without emotion. Stick to facts. Reference specific documents. Let the evidence speak. The trial was scheduled for early May. As the date approached, my anxiety built. I had trouble sleeping, replaying possible scenarios. What if the jury didn't believe me? What if Gerald's lawyers were better than I expected? What if this destroyed what remained of my career? 2 days before the trial started, Catherine called with an update. Gerald's legal team reached out about a settlement. They're offering to plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for avoiding trial. They want to know if you'd support that arrangement. My first reaction was relief. No trial meant no testimony, no cross-examination, no public confrontation. But then I thought about those injured workers, about the fact that Gerald would probably serve minimal time for lesser charges. What do you think? I asked. I think he's scared, Catherine said. His lawyers know our evidence is strong. They know you're credible. They want to control the damage before a jury hears everything. What happens if we go to trial? If we win, he faces significant prison time and permanent professional sanctions. If we lose, he walks away and probably sues you for defamation. The risk was real, but so was the chance for real accountability. I want to proceed with trial, I said. He made his choices. Now he can face the consequences. The morning of the trial, I arrived at the courthouse an hour early. The building was imposing granite and glass, with security checkpoints and metal detectors. I'd never testified in court before, never been inside a federal courtroom. The whole process felt surreal. Catherine met me in the hallway outside the courtroom. You ready? As ready as I'll be. Remember, just tell the truth. Answer the questions directly. Don't elaborate unless asked. And don't let the defense attorneys make you angry. That's what they want. We entered the courtroom together. It was smaller than I'd imagined, with wood-paneled walls and rows of benches for observers. The jury box sat empty, waiting for selection to conclude. And there, at the defense table, sat Gerald Hoffman. He wore an expensive charcoal suit and had the same confident posture I remembered. His legal team consisted of 3 attorneys in matching dark suits, all carrying expensive leather briefcases. For a moment, our eyes met across the courtroom. His expression flickered, surprise and recognition, before settling back into cold neutrality. The trial began with opening statements. Catherine laid out the prosecution's case methodically. How Gerald had pressured me to falsify reports. How I'd refused and been terminated. How he'd then modified the documents himself and used them to secure financing. How those falsified reports led directly to safety violations that injured workers. Gerald's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Preston Nash, presented a different narrative. I was a disgruntled employee with a history of insubordination. I'd been fired for legitimate performance issues. The modified reports reflected updated information and were entirely appropriate. Any suggestion of fraud was simply my attempt at revenge. The jury listened attentively, their faces neutral and unreadable. Over the next 3 days, Catherine called witnesses. The injured workers who described the scaffold collapse. The engineers who'd flagged the original violations. The investigators who'd traced the document modifications. On Thursday afternoon, Catherine called me to the stand. My heart hammered as I walked to the witness box and raised my right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Catherine started with background questions. My education. My experience in construction compliance. My hiring at Hoffman Construction. Easy questions designed to establish my credibility. Then she moved to September. Can you describe what happened in the meeting with Gerald Hoffman on September 15th? I explained it step by step. The quarterly reports showing violations. Gerald's pressure to modify them. His threats when I refused. My termination and public humiliation. Why did you refuse to make the changes Mr. Hoffman requested? Catherine asked. Because the violations were real safety issues. Altering reports to hide them would have been fraud, and it would have put workers at risk. What happened to those reports after you were fired? Gerald modified them himself. He downgraded critical violations, changed inspection dates, and removed engineering reports. Then he used my digital signature authorization to make it look like I'd approved the changes. Catherine projected one of the altered documents on a screen for the jury. Is this your signature? No. That signature was added electronically using administrative access. I never signed or approved that document. We went through report after report, each one showing modifications, each one connected to Gerald's authorization code. The evidence was overwhelming and systematic. During cross-examination, Preston Nash went on the attack immediately. Mr. Carver, you were fired from Hoffman Construction, weren't you? Yes. And you were angry about that termination? I was upset about being publicly humiliated, yes. Upset enough to fabricate evidence against your former employer? I didn't fabricate anything. The evidence comes from Hoffman Construction's own servers. Nash pulled out a document. According to your personnel file, you received multiple warnings about insubordination and failure to follow company protocols. Isn't that true? I received warnings for refusing to compromise safety standards. That's not the same as insubordination. But you were difficult to work with. You refused to be a team player. I kept my voice steady. I refused to break the law. If that makes me difficult, then yes, I was difficult. Nash switched tactics, trying to confuse me with technical details and rapid-fire questions. But Catherine had prepared me well. I answered each question directly, referenced specific documents, and stayed calm. Mr. Carver, isn't it true that you have a financial motive for testifying today? You're being paid as a consultant on this case. I'm being compensated for my time reviewing documents, yes. But my testimony is based on evidence, not payment. And isn't it convenient that this evidence just happens to support your version of events? The evidence supports what actually happened. The metadata doesn't lie. After 90 minutes, Nash finally sat down. I'd survived cross-examination without falling apart. Catherine asked a few follow-up questions to clarify points Nash had confused, then I was dismissed. As I walked back to my seat, I glanced at Gerald. He was leaning over, whispering urgently to Nash. He looked worried. The trial continued for another week. The prosecution called digital forensics experts who confirmed the timeline of document modifications. Financial analysts who traced how the falsified reports were used to secure investor funding. Then Gerald took the stand in his own defense. Preston Nash led him through carefully scripted questions. Gerald portrayed himself as a dedicated businessman, trying to save jobs and complete critical infrastructure projects. The modifications to compliance reports were simply administrative updates, reflecting corrected information. He'd never intended to deceive anyone. I was a problematic employee who'd been terminated for legitimate reasons. My testimony was revenge, nothing more. But during cross-examination, Catherine destroyed his narrative piece by piece. Mr. Hoffman, you testified that the report modifications reflected corrected information. Where did those corrections come from? Gerald hesitated. From updated inspections. Can you provide documentation of those updated inspections? They would have been filed with the project records. We've reviewed all project records. No such inspections exist. Gerald's confidence wavered. Then they must have been verbal updates from the site supervisor. The site supervisor testified yesterday that he provided no such updates. In fact, he specifically stated that the violations Mr. Carver documented were never corrected. Catherine projected an email on the screen. This is a message you sent to your administrative assistant on September 18th. You wrote, "Need to clean up those compliance reports before the investor meeting. Mitchell's version is too negative. Make the necessary adjustments." What did you mean by necessary adjustments? I meant presenting the information more positively. By downgrading critical violations to minor concerns? By providing appropriate context? By lying to investors about safety conditions? Preston Nash objected loudly, but the damage was done. Gerald spent another hour on the stand, contradicting himself, getting tangled in his own explanations. Catherine hammered him with document after document, each one showing exactly when modifications were made and who authorized them. By the time Gerald stepped down, he looked exhausted and defeated. His carefully constructed story had collapsed under the weight of actual evidence. The final day of trial brought closing arguments. Preston Nash made a passionate appeal, claiming the prosecution had failed to prove intentional fraud. Every business made difficult decisions. Sometimes reports needed adjustment to reflect evolving situations. Gerald was guilty of nothing more than trying to keep a project alive during challenging times. Then Catherine stood. She walked the jury through the timeline again. How I'd documented real violations. How Gerald had demanded falsification. How I'd been fired for refusing. How he'd modified the reports anyway. How those false reports led to injured workers. This case isn't complicated, Catherine said. Gerald Hoffman knowingly falsified safety documents to deceive investors and regulators. When his compliance director refused to participate, he fired that person and did it himself. 3 men were seriously injured because he valued money over safety. She paused, making eye contact with each juror. Mitchell Carver lost his job for telling the truth. Gerald Hoffman kept his job by lying. Now you have to decide who faces consequences for those choices. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 48 hours of waiting while I tried to work and failed to concentrate on anything. Catherine called with updates. The jury had requested specific documents. They were reviewing the timeline again. They'd asked questions about intent and knowledge. Finally, on a Wednesday afternoon, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. I rushed to the courthouse, my stomach churning with anxiety. The courtroom filled quickly with lawyers, observers, and media reporters who'd been following the case. Gerald sat at the defense table, his face pale but composed. The judge entered and everyone stood. Then the jury filed in, their expressions carefully neutral. I tried to read their faces and found nothing. The foreperson handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. She read it silently, her face revealing nothing, then handed it back. The defendant will please rise. Gerald stood with his attorneys flanking him. On the charge of securities fraud, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. My breath caught. On the charge of falsifying official documents, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of criminal negligence, how do you find? Guilty. Gerald's knees buckled slightly. One of his attorneys grabbed his arm to steady him. The judge continued reading through all 7 charges. Guilty on every count. When it was over, she scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later and dismissed the jury with thanks for their service. Gerald's legal team immediately requested bail pending appeal. The judge granted it reluctantly, setting conditions including surrender of passport and weekly check-ins. As court security prepared to process him, Gerald turned and looked directly at me. His face was ashen, his confident mask completely shattered. For just a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered those injured workers and the feeling passed. Outside the courthouse, Catherine shook my hand firmly. You did excellent work. That testimony made the difference. I just told the truth. That's exactly what made the difference, she said. A lot of people wouldn't have had the courage to do what you did. Refusing to falsify those reports cost you your job. But it also saved lives. If you'd gone along with it, who knows how many more people would have been hurt. Media reporters clustered nearby, shouting questions. Catherine waved them off. Mr. Carver won't be making any statements today. I was grateful. I didn't want attention or interviews. This had never been about publicity. The sentencing hearing 6 weeks later was brief. Gerald's attorneys presented character witnesses and argued for leniency. He'd made mistakes but didn't deserve prison time. He had no prior record. He'd already suffered professionally. The judge listened patiently, then delivered her ruling. Mr. Hoffman, you were in a position of authority and trust. You deliberately falsified documents that endangered workers. When an employee tried to stop you, you destroyed their career and reputation. Your actions resulted in serious injuries. I see no reason for leniency. She sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison, with possibility of parole after 3. Additionally, he was permanently barred from holding any executive position in construction or development. His professional license was revoked. He was ordered to pay restitution to the injured workers. Gerald stood motionless as the sentence was read. When it was over, security escorted him away. This time there would be no bail, no delays. He would begin serving his sentence immediately. I watched him disappear through the door and felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief, validation, exhaustion, but not satisfaction exactly. This had never been about revenge. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm and bright. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, just breathing. For the first time in over a year, the weight I'd been carrying felt lighter. My phone buzzed with messages. Brenda from Kemp Associates congratulating me. My sister saying she'd seen news coverage. Former colleagues reaching out to say they'd known I was right all along. I responded to a few, then put the phone away. This chapter was finally closed. The story made headlines for a few days. Construction executive convicted of fraud. Whistleblower testimony leads to prison sentence. Several outlets requested interviews. I declined them all. Speaking to reporters felt wrong somehow. This wasn't my story to tell. It belonged to those injured workers who'd trusted their employer to keep them safe. Within weeks, the media moved on to other scandals. Gerald's conviction became another cautionary tale about corporate fraud. Most people forgot about it quickly. But in the construction compliance world, the case had lasting impact. Industry associations updated ethics guidelines. Companies implemented stronger oversight of safety documentation. Several states strengthened whistleblower protections for compliance professionals. Kemp Associates received official recognition from the Federal Prosecutor's Office for cooperation in the investigation. My name was included in the commendation letter. Brenda framed it and hung it in the conference room. You should be proud, she told me. You did the right thing when it cost you everything. Not many people have that kind of integrity. I appreciated her words, but mostly I just felt tired. The trial had drained something essential. I needed time to process everything that had happened. That summer, I took 2 weeks off and drove to the coast. I stayed in a cheap motel and spent my days walking on the beach, letting the ocean noise quiet my thoughts. Slowly, the knots in my chest began to unwind. I'd been carrying anger and hurt for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to exist without them. When I returned to work, something had shifted. The trial was over. Gerald was in prison. The chapter was closed. Now I could finally focus on moving forward instead of looking back. Kemp Associates promoted me to senior analyst. The raise brought my salary above what I'd made at Hoffman Construction. More importantly, the work felt meaningful. Every case I worked on helped expose fraud or verify compliance. I was making a difference. One afternoon in September, exactly 1 year after my termination, I received an unexpected visitor. Vincent, my former colleague from Hoffman Construction, stopped by the office. I hope it's okay that I came by, he said, looking nervous. I wanted to tell you something. We got coffee at the shop downstairs. Vincent stirred his drink for a long moment before speaking. I was the one who filed the anonymous tip with the federal investigators. After you were fired, Gerald brought in someone else to run compliance. Someone who didn't ask questions. I watched him falsify more reports. I watched the safety violations get ignored. And I kept thinking about what you'd said. About not being able to compromise when lives were at stake. He looked up, meeting my eyes. I couldn't keep working there and pretending everything was fine. So I contacted the investigators and told them what I knew. I'm sorry I didn't do it sooner. I'm sorry I didn't speak up when Gerald fired you. I felt something ease in my chest. You did speak up. You reported it. That took courage. Not as much courage as refusing in the first place, Vincent said. You lost your job for doing the right thing. I just couldn't let that be for nothing. We talked for over an hour. Vincent had left Hoffman Construction after Gerald's arrest. He'd found work at a smaller firm with better values. Several other colleagues had done the same. The company was struggling now. Its reputation damaged by the scandal. Good, I said and meant it. Some organizations deserve to fail when their culture was rotten from the top. As Vincent left, he shook my hand firmly. Thank you for not backing down. You showed the rest of us what integrity looks like. After he was gone, I sat in the coffee shop for a while longer, watching people pass by on the street. All those months I'd thought I was alone. But Vincent had been watching. Others had been watching. My choice to refuse had mattered beyond just my own situation. The following week, I received a letter from one of the injured workers. His name was Tony Breslin. He'd been one of the men hurt in the scaffold collapse. He wrote that he'd followed the trial and wanted to thank me for testifying. I spent 3 months recovering from surgeries, his letter said. I was angry at everyone. The company. The supervisors. Myself for being in the wrong place. Then I learned about what happened with you and Mr. Hoffman. I learned that you tried to stop it before anyone got hurt. I learned you lost your job for trying to protect people like me. He continued, nobody can give me back the time I lost or fix my injuries completely. But knowing someone cared enough to fight for what was right, that helps. Thank you for your courage. I read the letter 3 times. Then carefully filed it with my important documents. On days when work felt hard or frustrating, I would remember Tony's words and why this work mattered. The construction industry began to change, slowly but noticeably. More companies implemented independent compliance reviews. Whistleblower protections got stronger. Regulatory oversight increased. None of it would have happened without the trial and conviction. Gerald's case became a reference point. Proof that falsifying safety documents carried real consequences. I continued working at Kemp Associates, building a reputation for thorough analysis and ethical standards. Companies specifically requested me for sensitive cases, where they needed someone who couldn't be pressured or compromised. My career rebuilt itself on a stronger foundation than before. 2 years after the trial, I was offered a position as Director of Compliance Standards for a regional construction association. The role involved developing industry-wide best practices and training compliance professionals. I accepted. The new position let me influence systemic change rather than just individual cases. I developed training programs that emphasized ethical decision-making and how to handle pressure from executives. I didn't celebrate Gerald's downfall. I just watched quietly as karma worked its way through. It was indeed a long journey, but my resilience, dedication to work, I got back all that I was denied of. Not through rage, not through revenge. I have learned that through revenge is facing your life, while karma does its work.